Gorgeous. And I was going to talk up here, and I got together with Maggie a little bit beforehand. I had to ask her if she was still going to be sitting up here when I talk. It's going to make me a little nervous. You know, the theme this month is soul, only it's not exactly so. We're spelling out things again. It's spirituality and oneness and utilities and laundry. These get too complicated for me, obviously, so I'm sticking with soul. And soul comes from an old Germanic word, "sao," which meant from the waters. Because the Norse people believed that when you were born, the soul came out of one of the sacred lakes to go into your body and then return to that lake. And people have had a lot of different versions of souls and what they are, of course, and what they do. The most standard one, obviously, is one soul per person, but that's not the only belief. The shaman of the Altai believed that a man has one soul and a woman has 40 souls. And in certain Taoist sects, they believe that every person has 3 male souls and 7 female souls. And, you know, I don't want to say anything about women having a hard time making up their minds, but it could be a relationship. But, you know, most believe in one soul, and of course the issue is what happens with the soul when the physical body passes on. And that's the main issue that most people talk about with souls. And again, there's been a wide variety of beliefs. That the Greeks and Romans, they had lots of different religions, but their primary one was that the soul goes to Hades. Now, Hades isn't, we associate it with hell, but Hades is not the same as hell. It's not a punishment or anything. All souls would go there under the ground. It's not a particularly nice place. It's just, you're just kind of there. It's sort of like being at a really boring party where there's nothing to do for eternity. That's kind of what's now, among the Navajo, they believed that the good part of a person went on to somewhere else, but the evil part stayed around. And if you were passing away and people knew that, they would take you outside so that the evil part of the soul could move on. But if that didn't happen and you died in the house, then the house had to be abandoned. And they would knock a special hole in it so that this evil soul could get out. And when you went home, you had to go in a zigzag pattern so this evil part of the soul didn't follow you, because it could cause disease and injury and stuff. So there's been a lot. The Buddhist, of course, and Hindu beliefs that the soul goes through reincarnation from one life to the next, up until you reach this enlightenment and nirvana, in which case you blend in with the great, in effect, oneness of the universe. And then the Christians have the heaven and hell, and if you can't figure out which, purgatory, for those who have that. And you know, in New Thought, based on religious science, it doesn't deal a lot with what happens to your soul afterwards. It's obviously there's no judgment thing from a God, but as a spiritual people, we need to look at that seriously and say, what does it mean, and how does it affect our lives? And there's kind of 2 versions of this. One is that our lives don't really affect our souls. Our soul is a perfect entity who comes into this body and experiences it and leaves. and I know, Angie, you say this sometimes, that the soul's on vacation. And, you know, that's a possibility. The big problem with that is, if it's true, then my talk is over. Because there's really not much more to say about it, you know, because all I could say is, do anything you want, you know, rob banks or steal little kids' candy or feed the homeless. It's all the same to your soul, eventually. It's just like you're on a carnival ride for the soul experiencing things. So, you know, that's a possibility, but let's look at the other alternative. The alternative that your life actually does, your physical life affects your soul. Now, this has its own problem, of course. It has a very inherent difficulty for people. Because if your life is somehow doing something to the soul, then the soul is not perfect and always the same. And so that's the difficulty we have to deal with. How can the soul be a part of the divine and be perfect and yet change during lifetime? And I was thinking about this, and I thought, you know, one of the things I think we can say we know is that life is a reflection, the physical universe is a reflection of the divine. We've talked about this before. There aren't two worlds. There isn't the spiritual divine heaven up there somewhere, and then the dirty, unrelated earth that God reaches into sometimes. But rather, they're both a part of the same, and the divine laws are what guide the physical laws. And therefore, by looking at the physical, can we reflect back on what does that mean to the divine? And one thing about the physical, one unquestionable aspect, is that nothing is permanent. Nothing. You know, the very body that we're in is not the body we were born with. It's not even the body we had a month ago or a week ago. Every cell, every molecule in our body changes, and one leaves and another comes in. The mountains that are there for generations are not permanent. Millions and millions of years ago, they were created, they're being worn away, and they'll go. The earth is around for millions of years, but not forever. The stars might be there for 10 billion years, but they start and they stop. The very laws of physics are not permanent. Because in what's called a singularity, a black hole, the laws of physics don't exist. They change. They're different in some way we don't know. And so, if in physical reality there isn't this permanence, then perhaps that's true in the spiritual reality too. And in the physical reality, there's another aspect of it that's interesting, is that what we think of logical how things are isn't true. The very physical existence is ambiguity. We've talked about this again, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Things can be one thing and the total opposite. Things can be in two places at one time. Things can exist and not exist at the subatomic level. And so if that is true, if the physical laws say that you can have both things that are and are not, perhaps at the spiritual, we can have perfection that's not unchanging. And so our souls could be perfect and yet change, be incomplete somehow. And how would that be? Well, one of the ways, maybe when the soul comes into the physical body, there's spiritual laws that guide that. That say, when the soul comes into the spiritual body, you got to give up some things. You're not going to be all-powerful. You're not going to be all-knowing. When the soul comes into the spiritual body, you're going to play a game called hide and seek from yourself. And so maybe that process of coming into the physical body, the spiritual, loses its contact with the eternal. And what our job is to help the soul recontact. But I want to go back to one other aspect of that, as I talked about that my mind's filtering through this talk that's over there to find it.
Oh yeah, mine does.
Sometimes the filter works better than others. To show that there is no permanence, I want to bring up a more radical idea on this. And I know traditionally in spiritual groups that if someone went against the beliefs of the group, they could well be stoned. I understand. But I'm not afraid of that happening. It's not because I really trust all of you. It's because in the greetings, if they seemed a little different today, I asked people when they gave you a hug to pat you down to make sure nobody had any rocks on them. So I think we'll be okay with that part of it. So let's go to this idea. The physical cannot be separate. Physical laws don't just exist. They are created by the divine. And there is no permanence within physical laws whatsoever. And so could that be a reflection of the eternal? I mean, we come up with this idea that there is an unchanging oneness. But where does that come from? If the physical is a reflection of the spiritual, and the physical, everything changes, maybe the eternal can be perfect and yet growing and changing. Maybe divine permanence would be like saying divine stagnation. So if the divine oneness is actually growing and changing, how would it do that? Maybe it happens because the soul is a seed. Maybe that's what the soul is. Maybe the soul is a seed planted in us. And what each of us are kind of a hothouse to grow that seed. And maybe then there is some role our lives play in growing this beautiful seed so that it would be planted in the eternal garden of oneness that is growing and changing. And if that's true, then each soul has its journey within us to grow and blossom until it is ready to be planted in eternity. And how do we do that then? How would we help it do it? And I'm going to suggest 3 ways. One is learning. Now, we don't usually think of learning in the relation to the soul and the development, but you know, I think that's important. When you look at any of it, if you look at yoga or Zen, and I mean Zen's teaching, of course, is that you can't really understand truth through words. And yet in all of that, you have to start somewhere. If somebody didn't explain to you what Zen was, how would you be a part of it? If somebody doesn't explain yoga or meditation, even though if your idea of it is to develop past that, you must first start with that learning. And so we need to